Hi, my name's Marla. 3 winters ago, my husband's family threw my daughter and me out into a snowstorm, laughing as the door slammed behind us. They said it was a lesson in humility. All I had was a rusted school bus, a child with frostbitten fingers, and a dog that refused to leave our side. But here's the thing about storms. They don't always destroy. Sometimes they teach you how to build fire. And when the same people came back, begging for mercy, I had already learned how to live without their warmth. Before we dive in, tell me, where are you listening from right now? Because this isn't just my story. It's what happens when silence learns to fight back. They told me this was my lesson in humility. I guess they forgot what real humility feels like. The wind that night cut through every layer of clothing I had left. Snow whipped against my face like glass. Grace stood beside me, her small hand gripping mine, shaking not just from the cold, but from fear. She was 9, too young to understand cruelty dressed up as moral teaching. Behind us, the porch light flickered, a pale yellow glow in the storm. Vernon's mother stood on the steps, wrapped in her fur-lined coat, holding her coffee like it was some prize for righteousness. "You brought this on yourself, Marla," she said, her voice sharp and clean like the air. "Maybe now you'll learn what it means to be humble." Her son, my ex-husband, didn't even look at me. He just tossed our suitcases into the snow and muttered, "Let's go, Ma." The car engine rumbled to life, headlights cutting through the storm as they drove off, leaving the sound of spinning tires and laughter behind. I didn't cry. I couldn't. Tears would have frozen before they hit my cheeks anyway. I bent down, zipped Grace's jacket higher, and whispered, "Keep your face tucked in, baby. We're gonna be fine." She nodded, trusting me the way only children do when they still believe their parents can fix anything. A small dog, maybe a shepherd mix, limped out from behind the fence, its fur matted and dusted with ice. It stared at us for a moment, then wagged its tail once, like it had decided we were its people now. Before we turned to leave, Grace did something I'll never forget. She tore a scrap of paper from her notebook and scribbled something quickly. Then she ran up to the porch, set it by the door, and came back. "What did you write?" I asked. She smiled weakly. "I told them the light's still on." Through the swirling snow, I looked back at that house, my former home, glowing faintly through the storm. It looked warm, safe, alive. But we weren't welcome there anymore. We walked until the lights faded behind us, and the only sound left was the crunch of our boots in the snow. By the time we found the bus, my hands were numb and my legs felt like wood. It sat on the edge of an old property, its paint eaten away by rust, its windows cracked, but still there. A ruin, but a shelter. Inside smelled like metal and dust. The seats were torn open, yellow foam peeking out like old scars. I cleared one corner and spread what blankets we had left. Grace crawled under my coat, her breath warm against my chest. The dog curled at our feet, a little lump of loyalty we hadn't asked for but needed. I tried lighting a candle from an old emergency kit I'd kept. The flame trembled like it didn't believe it belonged here. The wind howled outside, rattling the bus so hard it felt alive. "Mom?" Grace's voice was small. "Yeah, baby? Are we poor now?" I hesitated. "No, we're just starting over." She nodded, her eyes closing. I sat there for a long time, staring at that tiny flame, listening to the storm claw at the metal. Humility, I thought. Maybe it's just the name they give to being forgotten. I didn't sleep that night. I kept my arm around Grace, whispering stories until my voice cracked, anything to drown out the sound of the wind. When morning came, everything outside was white, silent, the kind of silence that hurts your ears. I stepped out, the cold biting at my skin, when I heard the hum of a truck engine in the distance. Vernon's truck. He slowed as he passed, window rolled down just enough to let his words out. "You'll thank me one day," he called. "Maybe this'll teach you." something inside me snapped. Not loud, just clean, like a frozen branch breaking. I met his eyes through the blowing snow and said quietly, "Maybe it'll teach you." He didn't hear me. Or maybe he did, and it scared him more than he'd admit. When the truck disappeared over the hill, I felt something new take root inside me. Not anger, not yet, but the beginning of resolve. The storm finally broke that afternoon. I stepped out again, the light gray and heavy, the air still sharp. The bus creaked with every gust, and the dog barked once, almost like it agreed with what I was thinking. I looked up at the sky and whispered, "We'll survive this, and one day they'll know what real humility looks like." My hands were cracked and raw, but I started gathering scraps of wood nearby, anything to make the bus a little more livable. The candlelight flickered behind me, catching the reflection of my face in the cracked window, tired, hollow-eyed, but alive. That night, as I tucked Grace under the blanket, I realized something. Survival wasn't the hard part. It was everything that came after. I didn't sleep much that night. Grace had curled herself into my side like a kitten, and the dog, who she decided to name Benny without asking me, pressed close to our feet. The air inside the bus had warmed slightly, not because of the candle, but because of the way survival makes bodies cling to each other like lifelines. When the first pale light cut through the cracked windows, I was already awake. My back ached from the metal floor, and my fingers burned from the cold. Grace stirred a little but didn't open her eyes. I brushed the hair from her forehead and sat up slowly. The scent of rust filled my nose, sharp and sour, the kind of smell that sticks to your clothes. Outside, the snow had stopped, leaving behind a crusted layer that glistened like glass in the morning sun. I opened the bus door gently, trying not to wake either of them, and stepped into the day. There was nothing romantic about that morning. My stomach had been empty since the night before, and now it snarled like a wild thing. I started walking, slow, careful steps down the side road until I reached the highway rest stop half a mile away. No one gave me a second look. A few cars passed. A man in a flannel jacket lit a cigarette outside his pickup, saw me, and turned his back. Behind the rest stop, where the vending machine stood, I spotted a small trash bin. Desperation isn't something you plan for. You just get to the moment where digging through a pile of wrappers for stale crackers doesn't feel disgusting, it feels necessary. I found half a packet of saltines, crushed but edible. I wiped them on my coat sleeve out of habit, knowing full well the sleeve was just as dirty. Still, when I broke them in half later and handed a piece to Grace and a crumb to Benny, it felt like an offering. Funny how a crumb feels like luxury when you've been stripped of everything, I muttered to myself. Grace munched slowly, saying nothing. She didn't ask where I got the crackers. She was learning not to ask too many questions. As I leaned back against the cold frame of the bus, a large pickup slowed on the road. My whole body tensed. I recognized that feeling, part fear, part hope, part shame. The driver was a stranger, a man maybe in his 60s, gray beard, heavy-set. He looked at me too long, then drove on. I exhaled. Relief and humiliation. Two things that don't usually arrive together. It was late afternoon when I saw her. A woman walking with a knit cap pulled down to her ears and a tote bag clutched to her side. She stopped about 20 feet from the bus, looking at me the way someone might look at a wild animal they're deciding whether to approach. "You Marla?" she asked. I didn't answer right away. "My name's Edith Larkins," she said. "I live up the road, retired school teacher. I brought you some soup and a blanket." I didn't move. People don't survive winters here without help. Pride doesn't keep you warm. I remembered Vernon's voice like it was stitched into my spine. "You always take what isn't yours." I almost told her no. But Grace was sitting inside, too cold to speak, too still for my comfort. "Thank you," I said, voice tight. "But we're okay." Edith looked at me for a long beat. Then she set the bag down near the wheel well, Suit yourself, but there's extra in the pot, in case you change your mind." She turned and left. Didn't wait, didn't push, and that made all the difference. That night, I warmed the soup over a dented tin plate. Grace lit up at the smell like it was Thanksgiving. I let her eat first. When she offered me the last few spoonfuls, I took them. Not because I was hungry, though I was, but because it meant something to her that I did. Accepting that soup was the first time I realized I still had choices, maybe not big ones, but enough to start. Later that night, while the wind whispered against the bus again, I heard Grace's voice, low, almost inaudible. "Do you think Daddy will ever say sorry?" she asked Benny. I froze. The dog didn't answer, obviously. But I almost did. I had the words right at the edge of my tongue. Instead, I reached for a notebook. One Vernon had tossed into the suitcase without thinking. Most of the pages were torn, but there were a few clean ones left. I wrote, "Apologies are for people who remember what they did." I didn't know what I meant by that exactly, but I wrote it anyway. That notebook would become more than a journal. It would become my map. The next morning, while cleaning the back of the bus, I pried open a rusted compartment under the seat and found something I hadn't expected: a metal mixing bowl, an old sifter, and a wooden spoon. For a second, I just stared at them. Then I laughed, a short, surprised breath. The smell of flour, faint but still there, hit me like memory. Before Vernon, before all of it, I used to bake. Dreamed of opening a small cafe on Main Street, cookies in the window, coffee brewing at dawn. I'd traded that dream for a mortgage I didn't own, and a man who swore loyalty with one hand while hiding secrets in the other. I touched the sifter, and it felt like touching the past, but it didn't make me sad. It made me ready. Over the next couple days, Edith started showing up with little things: old flour, canned milk, baking powder, said they were extras from her pantry. I didn't argue. I baked my first loaf using what she gave me and that dented bowl. It came out flat but edible. The crust was hard, the inside still doughy. Edith took a bite anyway. "You're not bad," she said, wiping her mouth with her glove. "Needs work, but not bad." She pulled a dollar bill from her coat pocket and placed it in my hand. "I'm not taking your money," I said, pulling back. "You are," she said. "Every good thing deserves value. Even now, especially now." That night, I baked 2 more loaves. I handed one to a woman at the gas station nearby. She gave me 2 crumpled dollars and asked if I'd have more tomorrow. I named it the Bus Bakery the next morning. Grace painted the name in red on the side of the bus using leftover spray paint from Edith's shed. The letters were crooked, some ran into each other, but it was ours. When I saw her standing back, admiring her work, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Not relief, not comfort, hope. And it didn't cost a thing. Later that night, after Grace had fallen asleep with her fingers dusted in flour, I heard a noise. Benny. He'd somehow climbed up on the seat and was halfway through a loaf of bread I'd left cooling. "Hey!" I shouted. He paused, tail wagging like he knew he was guilty but didn't care. Grace sat up groggy, looked at the scene, and laughed. Really laughed, for the first time since the snowstorm. I couldn't help it. I laughed too, loud and wet, tears streaming down my face before I even realized they'd come. "This," I whispered, pulling the blanket over her shoulders. "This is what starting over sounds like." The sound of our laughter drifted out through the broken windows into the cold, empty field. And for once, it didn't echo back like loss. After that night, something shifted in the air around us, not just in the bus, but in the rhythm of our days. Summer had quietly replaced the bitter snow. The field around us turned green, dotted with patches of yellow wildflowers. Grace would pick them and line the bus windows like it was her own version of wallpaper. I planted a few by the door, too. Didn't expect them to take, but they did. Maybe we both needed something to root for. The rust on the bus still showed in places, but I'd managed to patch up the roof, fix a few windows with plexiglass from Edith's garage, and repaint the door. The bakery wasn't perfect, but it smelled of cinnamon and yeast on most mornings, and that was enough. I started selling bread and pies at the weekend market in town. It wasn't much, but folks remembered my name, the Bus Bakery. Some came just to smile, some to talk. I began to recognize them by their orders. There was Mr. Harlan, who always asked for extra crust on his cherry pie. And Dottie, the retired nurse who slipped me homemade jam as a thank you. I used to think peace was silence, I told Edith one afternoon while she sipped tea on the bus steps. Turns out it's just the absence of screaming. Grace had settled into a small school nearby. She came home each day with crayon drawings and stories about a girl named Emma who let her borrow hair clips. Her laughter had returned, not loud, but steady. Benny stayed close to her heels like he was guarding royalty. If anyone got near the bus and didn't smell right, he let them know. For the first time, I let myself believe we'd outrun the storm. But peace has a funny way of testing how badly you want to keep it. It was a Sunday when it happened. I was wrapping a loaf of honey oat for a woman I didn't recognize, middle-aged, kind smile. "You know," she said, glancing at my handwritten sign, "this bread reminds me of the old Crane family recipes." "You any relation to Vernon Crane?" My breath caught, just a second. Then I smiled, even. "No relation," I lied. "Common name." She didn't press, just nodded and walked off. But the moment she was gone, the sun felt a little hotter, the air a little tighter. I wiped my hands on my apron and reminded myself, that part of your life is over. You don't owe them anything. Except they always find a way back. Later that week, at the farmer's market, I saw her. Lydia, Vernon's sister. She didn't change much. Same sharp cheekbones, same cruel curve of the mouth. She didn't look at the pies or the breads. She looked straight at me and smirked. "Still pretending you're better than us?" she said, voice just loud enough to draw eyes. I set down the knife I was using to slice samples. My hands were shaking, but I didn't let them show. "No, Lydia," I said calmly. I just stopped pretending I deserved less. For a second, something flickered in her eyes, maybe surprise. Then she scoffed. "You'll regret stealing our name." The crowd around us shifted awkwardly, unsure whether to step in or step away. Lydia didn't wait for a response. She turned and walked off, heels clicking too hard against the pavement like she needed the sound to prove she still had control. I didn't chase after her. I didn't speak. But something inside me curled into a fist. That night, after we packed up and drove the bus back to the lot, I noticed it. A word scratched in red paint across the bus door. Thief. My first thought was to scrub it off before Grace saw, but she was already beside me, staring up at it. "Do you think it was just kids?" she asked, voice small. I wanted to tell her yes. I wanted to lie clean and easy. "Probably," I said, but the words tasted like metal. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat near the front of the bus with the curtain pulled back, watching the single light bulb flicker above us. Benny stirred in his sleep. Grace mumbled something about art class and drifted off again. I pulled out my notebook. "If peace has a price," I wrote, "I'll pay it. But not with silence." A week later, the town announced a fall festival. Posters went up in windows and gas stations. There'd be crafts, music, pumpkin pies. A local organizer stopped by the bakery booth to invite us. "We'd love to have the Bus Bakery be part of it. Folks around here talk about your apple spice loaf like it's gold." I was flattered, nervous, unsure. 2 days later, Edith handed me a copy of the vendor list. Lydia was on it. "Crane Heritage Goods," the flyer read. "Handmade pastries and preserves from the original Crane family cookbook." I didn't need a translator to see what that meant. They were coming. With name, with legacy, with the kind of weight that's meant to crush. I stared at the list for a long time that night. My fingers hovered over the phone. I almost called to cancel. Grace came in, fresh from her shower, wearing pajamas and hugging Benny close. She saw the flyer on the table and looked at me. "You told me brave means doing it scared," she said, eyes searching mine. "Remember?" I nodded. It was the same line I'd told her 6 months ago, when she didn't want to walk into a new classroom alone. And now it was mine to swallow. The night before the festival, I didn't stop moving. I kneaded dough until my wrists ached. Pies lined the counter. The smell of butter and cinnamon filled every crack in the bus. I looked around between batches, the glow of the oven, the hum of Grace's soft humming as she painted little thank you cards for our table, Benny dozing with his nose under a chair. I let my breath out slowly. The walls used to feel like a cage. Now they felt like a heartbeat. As the last pie cooled, I whispered to the quiet, "Tomorrow, we stop hiding." By sunrise, the dew on the bus windows had already started to dry. I was up before it did, tying my hair back in the tiny mirror nailed to the side wall. Grace stirred under her blanket, stretching, eyes still closed. "You excited?" I asked gently, already setting the bread loaves on a tray. She nodded, still half asleep. "Do I get to wear the yellow scarf?" "Of course. It's your booth, too." We arrived at the town square just as the sun crept over the trees, painting everything in gold. Grace skipped ahead, waving at Edith, who was already setting up her knitted scarves across the way. Benny, tail wagging, stayed close to my heels. Our spot was near the corner, not too close to the stage, just enough foot traffic. Grace unfolded her little crate of decorations, pulling out the yellow scarves we'd saved, the same shade as her old childhood blanket. She hung them with clothespins across the canopy while I set out the cinnamon rolls, pies, and fresh loaves. The scent of brown sugar and nutmeg floated into the crisp fall air. I saw familiar faces. Some smiled with warm recognition. Others offered tight nods or whispers as they passed. I didn't take it personally. Small towns forget slowly, but they never forget who watched who fall. "It's strange," I murmured to myself, adjusting the price sign, "how people forgive once they see you standing on your own feet." Then I saw her booth. Crane Family Recipes, in bold cursive font. Custom printed sign. A linen tablecloth with lace trim. Lydia stood behind it in a red blazer, adjusting jars of jam like she was setting a stage. It all looked curated, polished, expensive. I didn't have a single dollar in advertising, just a crooked sign and a lot of cinnamon. By 9 a.m., foot traffic was steady. Grace handed out free samples with a grin that made people stop and stay. Kids reached for cookies. Elders leaned in to ask about my baking process. I answered each one with patience and a smile I hoped didn't show how hard I was working to stay composed. Then the air shifted. I knew the footsteps before I saw the shoes. Leather soles, polished. Unfamiliar, in a place where most wore sneakers or work boots. Vernon. He looked like he stepped out of a real estate commercial. Sharp suit, fresh haircut, sunglasses pushed into his hair. Lydia followed a half-step behind, smug as ever. He stood in front of my booth, hands in his pockets, eyes scanning the table. "So, this is what you've been doing with your time?" he said, loud enough to draw glances. "Selling bread out of a tin can?" A few people chuckled, quiet, uncomfortable laughs, the same kind of sound I remembered the day they tossed our suitcases in the snow. Grace froze, eyes darting to me. I saw her grip the edge of the table. Vernon reached into his coat and pulled out a photo, holding it up for the crowd to see. Red spray paint. The word thief scratched into the side of our bus. "Still living off my family's name, huh?" The echo of humiliation hit me hard, right in the ribs. For a moment, I couldn't speak, couldn't move. Then I reached behind me, took a warm loaf of honey wheat, wrapped it in parchment, and handed it to him. "Then I suppose your family's name finally stands for something good," I said evenly. A hush fell. The crowd shifted. One or two people clapped. I didn't look to see who. From the side, Edith stepped forward. "You can't claim kindness when you abandoned your own blood," she said, voice sharp as frost. Vernon stiffened. Lydia looked ready to drag him back, but he stayed rooted. Murmurs started, about who I was, what he did, what they all did. A woman near the kettle corn booth pulled out her phone. Someone else whispered about a reporter in the crowd. Lydia leaned into Vernon's ear. "Let's go," she hissed. "You're making a scene." But he didn't move. His eyes were fixed on mine. "She'll ruin herself without our help," he said, mostly to himself. "I already did," I replied softly. "That's how I learned to build better." That line hung between us, longer than anything else we'd said. And then it was over. He walked away. Lydia stormed off ahead of him, heels snapping against the pavement like gunfire. The rest of the day felt like an exhale I hadn't realized I'd been holding. By noon, we were sold out. Grace danced barefoot behind the booth, holding Benny's ears and singing a made-up song about cinnamon bread. Locals came to shake my hand. A few offered business cards, suggestions to sell in nearby towns. Edith winked as she passed by with her scarf stand empty. Vernon lingered on the edge of the festival, near the cider stand, watching. I pretended not to notice. As we packed up, Grace was folding the scarves back into her crate when I saw him again. He walked past, slowly, and without saying a word, picked up the last loaf sitting on the corner of our table, the one I had meant to take home. He didn't speak. Neither did I. He walked away. The silence between us was heavier than anything he'd ever shouted. That night, the sun had already dipped behind the trees by the time we got back to the field. The bus glowed gently from the inside, a candle flickering near the front. Grace leaned her head on my shoulder as I parked. She started humming softly, some tune from school, or maybe something she made up. I looked at that little flame near the window and whispered, "The light is still on." Same words she'd once written when everything else was gone. Only now, they didn't feel like a plea, they felt like a promise. Not a loud one, not something to declare, but something that hummed quietly under the skin. Promises don't always need to be said out loud. Sometimes they're in the way you keep showing up every morning, even when it's cold, even when no one's watching. The first snow came early that year. Fat, slow flakes drifting over the fields, landing soft on the roof of the bus. The air smelled of cedar and smoke, the kind of scent that wraps around you and reminds you of all the winters you thought you wouldn't survive. Business was steady. People came not just for bread anymore, but to talk about their kids, their aches, their days. I didn't plan it that way. I just listened. Somehow the bus bakery had become a kind of confessional booth with cinnamon rolls. Grace had written an essay for school titled "The Warmest Bus in Town." It won a small ribbon, and her teacher had asked if I'd come in to talk about resilience. I didn't have the heart to tell her I wasn't sure I knew what that meant anymore. When I read the essay later that night, it said, "My mom makes people feel full, even when they come here empty." That one line hit harder than any award ever could. For the first time since everything fell apart, I let myself feel proud. The bus wasn't a cage anymore. It was a hearth. A place where warmth didn't come from wealth or luck, but from work, persistence, and grace. Literally, grace. It was close to midnight when I heard it. A knock. Sharp. 3 times. At first I thought it was the wind knocking loose a branch against the metal siding. But then it came again. Slower this time. Deliberate. Benny raised his head from the rug, ears pricked. Grace stirred in her sleep. I pulled my sweater tighter and walked to the door. And when I opened it, the cold rushed in, biting, raw. And standing there, covered in frost and regret, was Vernon. He looked nothing like the man who'd sneered at me at the festival. His hair was unkempt, face gaunt, suit wrinkled and out of place against the falling snow. "Don't slam the door," he said, voice thin. "I need your help." For a moment the words didn't register. Then they hit. The same words he'd said years ago, standing in that warm house, mocking me as Grace and I stood out in the cold. And now he was the one outside. I didn't say a thing. I just looked at him. The silence between us stretched long enough for the snow to start sticking to his shoulders. He spoke again, softer this time. "Lydia's gone. Took the money and ran. The company's under investigation. His breath hitched. "I've got nowhere else." I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorframe. "You built everything on a lie," I said quietly. He nodded once, eyes wet, but whether from cold or guilt, I couldn't tell. "I know," he whispered. "You were right." Benny barked once, sharp, like he was saying what I couldn't. Grace woke up then, rubbing her eyes. "Mom? What's going on?" Her voice made Vernon flinch. He looked past me, his face breaking. "Grace," he said, "you've grown." The way he said her name, careful, hesitant, made something twist inside me. She blinked, confusion and curiosity flickering in her eyes. "Mom, that's Dad." I stepped between them instinctively. "If you came for forgiveness," I said, steady but firm, "you're in the wrong place. If you came for warmth, I'll give you coffee." He nodded, swallowing hard. "Coffee's enough." I poured him a cup, the chipped mug that used to be his. He held it like something sacred, fingers shaking. Grace sat near the dog, watching him, unsure whether to speak. He started talking before I could ask. About the investors, the debts, Lydia's lies, and his own. How he'd signed things he didn't read, how the house was gone, how the people who'd laughed with him once now crossed the street to avoid him. "You always said everything had to fall apart before it could be rebuilt," he said finally, half smiling. "Guess I never thought it'd happen to me." "Guess you were wrong," I said. The bus was quiet after that. Only the sound of the wind brushing against the windows and the ticking of the small clock above the stove. Finally, he looked at me. "Just for a few nights. Until I figure out what's next." I didn't answer right away. Edith's words echoed in my head. Peace always costs something. Grace's hand found mine under the table. "Let him stay," she said softly. "Just for one night." I exhaled, slow. "One night," I said. "You sleep near the door. You leave when the sun does." He nodded quickly, grateful, almost too quickly. The power between us had shifted completely, and he knew it. We didn't talk much after that. Vernon sat near the entrance, close to the draft, wrapped in an old blanket. Benny lay between us like a living boundary, his tail twitching every time Vernon moved. Grace fell asleep again, her breathing soft and steady. Vernon looked around the bus, eyes moving across the walls, the tiny stove, the photographs Grace had taped up. "It's warmer than I remember," he murmured. I didn't look at him. "That's because you never stayed long enough to feel it." He didn't answer. Outside, the snow kept falling. Thick, silent flakes, just like that night years ago. Except this time, we were on the inside. The bus creaked with the weight of the wind. The candle flickered near the window, the same way it had when everything started. I reached over, blew it out, and whispered to no one in particular, "Lesson learned." The words lingered in my mind long after I'd blown out the candle. They sat heavy, like frost that refuses to melt, even when morning comes. When I opened my eyes, sunlight was already slipping through the frosted windows. The bus smelled faintly of coffee grounds and wood smoke. For a few seconds I thought maybe, just maybe, The night before had been some kind of dream. Then I saw the blanket folded neatly near the door, the spot where Vernon had slept. Empty. His mug still sat on the small counter, half full, steam long gone. The blanket looked too tidy. Vernon was never neat. Grace rubbed her eyes from the bunk. Where did he go? I glanced outside, pretending it was nothing. Wherever ghosts go when daylight finds them. She tilted her head like she didn't quite understand, then went back to petting Benny. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the air was wrong. Too still, too quiet. When I stepped outside, the wind hit hard. Tire marks traced faint circles in the snow, but they led nowhere. His car had never been there to begin with. That's when the chill set in, not from the air, but from the realization that he hadn't just left. He'd planned something. I didn't notice it at first. The morning went on like normal. I kneaded dough, prepped the bread for the market, brewed another pot of coffee. But when I reached for my folder, the one with all my business papers, tax forms, and land lease, the shelf was bare. My heart dropped. I tore through the bus, checking under blankets, behind crates, inside flour bins. Nothing. The folder was gone. At first I thought maybe I'd misplaced it, but deep down, I knew. I threw on my coat, told Grace to stay with Edith, and drove straight to town. The roads were icy, and the cold had a way of cutting through even the thickest jacket. When I reached the clerk's office, I could barely catch my breath. The woman behind the counter looked up from her computer. "Can I help you, Mrs. Crane?" "It's Ms.," I corrected automatically. "I need to check on the ownership documents for my bakery, the bus bakery. I think someone might have—" She cut me off gently, scrolling through her screen. "Oh, Mr. Crane was just in here this morning, said he was updating the joint ownership records." My mouth went dry. "Joint?" She nodded like it was routine. "He had paperwork showing shared assets. It looked legitimate, so we processed it for temporary verification. You'll need to file a dispute if it's an error." "An error?" My voice cracked. "He doesn't have that right anymore. We divorced. That bus, that lease, they're mine." She shrugged, almost apologetic. "You'll need proof, ma'am." "Proof." I wanted to laugh. The proof was sitting in his hands. By the time I got back to the bus, the afternoon light had already started to fade. I sat there in silence, the dog resting its head on my foot, Grace drawing by the window. My mind raced in circles. Every step forward I'd taken suddenly felt fragile again, like ice over deep water, and in a town this small, bad news traveled faster than wind. By evening, whispers had started. At the grocery store, two women paused mid-conversation when I walked past. One smiled too sweetly, the other didn't bother pretending. At the market, an old man I used to chat with about weather barely looked up from his paper. I saw the headline on his screen: Crane family dispute over business ownership. Lydia was back online, her posts dripping with venom. Funny how some people make a living off other people's names. It didn't take long for the comments to start piling up. Didn't she steal that bus from her ex's family? Guess she's finally getting what's coming to her. Grace saw it too. She came home from school with red eyes, holding her phone. "Mom," she whispered. "They're saying we lied." I knelt beside her, brushing the hair from her face. "Truth takes longer to rise," I told her, "like bread in the cold. But it always rises." Her small arms wrapped around my neck, and I held on until her breathing evened out. That night, I barely slept. Every creak outside made me tense. Every shadow looked like him. Then, just past midnight, I saw it. An orange flicker beyond the trees. Smoke. I ran out before I could even think, Benny barking behind me. The wind was bitter, cutting through my sleeves, but I kept running. The smell hit me first. Burning wood, oil, and something chemical. The old barn by the edge of the field, the one where I stored flour, sugar, and boxes for market days, was on fire. "Help!" I screamed into the dark. "Somebody help!" Edith appeared moments later, her coat thrown over her nightgown, shouting orders. A few neighbors joined in with buckets, snow shovels, anything they could grab. But the fire was hungry, greedy. It devoured the old wood like it had been waiting for this moment. We saved what we could, but the barn collapsed before sunrise. The glow of the flames painted the snow a violent orange. When the sheriff arrived, he walked the perimeter quietly. Then he pointed at something near the tree line. Footprints, boot prints, deep, heavy, and unmistakably male. I didn't need proof. I already knew. By morning, the fire was out, but the air still carried its ghost. I sat by the ashes, the smell of smoke clinging to my coat. Grace came up behind me, her small hand on my shoulder. "Are we going to lose everything again?" I turned to her. "Not this time." She leaned her head against me. We stayed like that for a long time, neither of us speaking. When I finally looked back at the bus, its single light flickered, the same way the candle had, the same way it always did when everything was about to change. Only this time, it stayed on. "I gave him warmth," I whispered, more to myself than anyone else. "He gave me ashes, but ashes can feed new roots, and I wasn't done growing yet." I woke the next morning to the sound of the postman's truck pulling away. The snow had mostly melted, leaving behind a soft, wet hush over the gravel drive. Grace was still asleep, her breath steady, tangled in flannel. I stepped out to the mailbox, boots sinking slightly into the thawing earth, and pulled out a heavy envelope marked Certified Mail. My name was printed in sharp block letters. The sender, Crane Associates Legal Group. I didn't need to open it to know. Back inside, I sat at the small table, the unopened letter in front of me, steam rising off a chipped coffee mug. It took me a few minutes to gather the courage, then I sliced it open with a butter knife. My eyes moved over the words slowly, unwilling to believe what I was reading. Notice of ownership dispute, filed by Vernon Crane, claiming joint rights to the land and business, citing documents that suggested the transfer had never been finalized. He hadn't just burned the barn. He was trying to burn the records. He didn't want me to lose. He wanted me to disappear. I didn't hear Grace until she was beside me, her voice small. "What is it, Mom?" I passed her the letter without a word. Her eyes scanned it, mouth parting. "He's trying to take the bakery?" I nodded once. "What do we do?" I looked at her then, really looked at her. My daughter, standing taller now, her gaze steady even in fear. "We fight," I said, my voice calm. "But not the way he expects." By afternoon, I'd made a list. Names, people, places I needed to visit. I started with Edith. She didn't say much, just poured me a cup of tea and handed me a notepad. "Let's write it all down, no detail too small." Next was Mrs. Harlan from the church bake sales, then Tom, the retired mechanic who fixed the bus's rear axle for free last winter. I told them the truth, plainly, not with anger, but with steady facts. Each one listened. Some apologized. Some offered to testify. All of them stayed longer than they needed to. That evening, while wiping down the bakery counter, I heard a knock on the bus door. A young man stood there, camera bag slung over one shoulder. I recognized him from the fall festival, the reporter who once wrote about my curious roadside bakery. "I heard what's going on," he said. "People love comebacks. Yours just happens to smell like fresh bread." I folded a cloth over my hands, then smiled faintly. "Then let's feed them the truth." Court was set 2 weeks later, in the old brick courthouse near downtown Duluth. The morning was gray, with patches of ice clinging to the sidewalk like forgotten promises. Inside, Vernon looked polished, his posture straight, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He wore his wedding ring again. His lawyer was the kind of man who smiled with his teeth, but not his eyes. They went first, presenting carefully arranged documents, forms Vernon claimed were overlooked during the divorce, printed in such a way that made it seem like the ownership had never fully shifted to me. He even accused me of forging certain dates. I didn't interrupt. I let the storm pass over. Then it was my turn. I handed over copies of original receipts, time-stamped photos of me painting the bus alone, building the shelves, running the stand. I dated everything. And then, the voicemail. I pulled out an old flip phone I kept in a box beneath my bed, the one I couldn't bring myself to throw out. "I have a recording," I said. "From the week we finalized our divorce. He left it when I didn't pick up." I pressed play. His voice echoed through the quiet courtroom. "You can keep your little bus bakery. It'll never amount to anything anyway." A few people glanced at each other. One woman gasped quietly. Even the judge sat back a little, tapping his pen against the desk. "We'll need to verify the recording," he said eventually, "but its authenticity appears likely." I exhaled for the first time that day. Outside the courthouse, the wind smelled different, not like snow, like thawing earth, the first breath of spring. The reporter met me near the steps, camera dangling at his side. "Win or lose," he said, "you've already turned this town around." Grace grabbed my hand, squeezing it tight. "You sounded like someone who's not scared anymore." I looked down at her. "That's because fear doesn't pay rent here anymore." That night, after the dishes were done and Grace had fallen asleep, I lit a single candle and placed it in the bus window. Same spot, same soft flicker. I sat with my notebook and wrote, "He used laughter once to break me. I used silence to rebuild. And today, silence won." I watched the flame dance but never falter. It was no longer just light. It was proof, not just of survival, but of transformation. That quiet glow from the window reminded me every night that I hadn't simply endured, I had rebuilt. And just when the world finally felt settled, the phone rang. It was a warm June morning, the kind where the sun rises early and slides in through the curtains before you've had your first sip of coffee. Grace was out walking the dog, humming something off-key. The oven clicked as it cooled from the pre-dawn bake. I wiped my hands on my apron, saw the caller ID, and froze. Lydia Crane. I almost let it go to voicemail. But curiosity is a stubborn thing. I answered. Her voice was thinner than I remembered. Brittle, almost. "Marla?" She coughed, then said, "It's Vernon." I didn't say anything. "He's sick. Heart failure. It's bad. He wants to see you." There it was. After years of gaslighting, betrayal, and loss, his voice was still reaching for mine. I stared at the chipped counter edge, ran my finger over the grooves. "You tell him," I said, voice calm but edged. "Some lessons come too late." There was a pause. Then, unexpectedly, I added, "But that doesn't mean no one listens." I didn't hang up. I just let her breathe into the silence before we both disconnected. 2 days later, I drove back down roads I'd once cried on, hands white-knuckled on the wheel. But this time, I wasn't the one being exiled. The Crane estate sat like a tired monument at the end of a winding gravel drive. Ivy choked the fence. The shutters sagged, paint peeled. Lydia met me at the gate. Her heels were gone, replaced with plain flats. Her hair, once immaculately blown out, was pulled back in a simple bun. "You look the same," she said. I looked her over. "You don't." Inside, the grand hallway smelled like antiseptic and dust. The dining table, once polished to a mirror shine, was buried in unopened mail and old magazines. Vernon lay in the den, barely a shadow of himself. Tubes and wires surrounded him. A portable oxygen machine hummed beside the bed. He turned his head slowly when I entered. His face was gaunt, skin too loose, eyes bloodshot, but clear. "You were right," he rasped. "The storm came for me after all." I stepped closer, not with vengeance but quiet certainty. "It came for both of us," I said. "I just built shelter faster." He let out something between a laugh and a cough. He began crying, not the kind of tears you fight, but the kind that fall because there's nothing left to hold on to. "Help me fix this," he whispered. "I don't want Grace to grow up hating me." I watched him, the same man who once stood in court with fake papers and that smug smirk, now curled into himself like a child afraid of the dark. "You taught me humility," I said, my voice steady. "This is yours now." He reached for my hand. I didn't take it. Instead, I pulled an envelope from my bag and placed it on the nightstand. "What's this?" he asked, eyes clouded with confusion. "Finalized transfer of the bakery and land, notarized, signed." "Why would you—" I cut him off gently. "Because I don't build graves. I build legacies." He broke then, not from sickness but from truth. I stood there while the man who once claimed to own me knelt in his own guilt. I left without saying goodbye. Outside, the sky was beginning to soften. There was a lightness in the air, as if even the wind had stopped holding its breath. Lydia followed me out. "He really did love you in his way," she murmured. I turned, but didn't stop walking. "That was his way," I said. "This is mine." Grace was waiting in the car, hands folded over her lap, eyes searching mine as I got in. "Did you forgive him?" she asked. I looked out the window at the dying estate. "I didn't need to," I said. "Forgiveness isn't for them. It's for us." She nodded. Nothing more needed to be said. That night, back at the bus, the sky shifted from rose gold to lavender. I lit a single candle in the same window where I once whispered prayers through tears. Now the bus had a porch. Flower boxes bloomed with marigolds and basil. The new sign read, "Crane's Hearth," not in irony, but in reclamation. Grace laughed with customers out front, apron dusted in flour. The dog, older now, napped by her feet. I sat with my notebook and watched the flame. The light stayed on, even through the storm. And somehow, that felt like enough. But life, in its quiet wisdom, doesn't always let the story end where we think it should. It just softens the edges, lets the light in through different windows. 2 years passed gently after that summer night. Seasons moved like they had manners, not rushing, not dragging, just letting time be time. The bus bakery had changed, not in soul, but in shape. What started as a rusty shell parked on frozen ground had grown into a real cafe. We kept the bus, the frame of it now cradled inside a small wooden structure Grace designed during her second semester. She insisted on calling it the Hearth. I didn't argue. It fit. Locals came by more than ever now, not just for coffee or bread, but to sit, to talk, to belong. Photos lined the walls, shots of the barn fire cleanup, the winter we thought we'd lose everything, the festival Grace won her award at. There were smiling faces of neighbors who once whispered about me. Now they brought in muffins and fresh eggs from their farms, just to be part of something warm. Sometimes I'd catch someone staring at a photo of the bus in its earliest days, rusted, tilted, curtains drawn shut, and they'd whisper, "Hard to believe this is the same place." I'd nod and smile. "It's not," I'd say, "but the heart of it is." Grace came home less, but she always came home. She was halfway through her program now, talking about designing shelters for women in crisis, said the bakery taught her what safety really looked like. "Once this bus was our exile," I whispered to a customer one evening, watching Grace sketch at a corner table. "Now it's our home, and everyone's." Lydia still came by now and then. She never stayed long. Just enough time to drop off tea or bring by one of Vernon's old books. She didn't cry. I think she'd run out of tears by then. Vernon had passed quietly. No dramatics, no final speech. Just one evening in late fall, his heart gave out like the last ember in a cold hearth. She left his ashes by the lake, the same lake where years ago they'd laughed when I spilled soup on my coat at one of their barbecues, the same lake where Vernon once told me, "You don't belong in our world." And now, he stayed there, silent. "He kept your last letter on his nightstand," Lydia said once, softly, almost like she was asking permission to share it. I didn't flinch. "We all keep things we never deserved," I said. There was no sting in it, just truth, and she knew it. Winter came again, as it always does in Minnesota, heavy, unapologetic. The snow made everything look like a postcard until you had to shovel it. It was on one of those nights, just before close, that I heard a knock on the glass door. It was already dark. Most folks were home by then. A young woman stood outside, coat too thin for the weather, holding the hand of a child no older than 4. Her cheeks were red from crying. Her eyes darted between the cafe sign and the bus behind it. I stepped out from behind the counter. "Can I help you?" "My car?" she choked out. "It just died. And it's freezing. I don't know anyone here. Please, we just need somewhere to warm up." I looked at her. Not just the fear in her eyes, but the echo of a younger version of myself. A woman left out in the cold, unsure who to trust. "There's soup on the stove," I said, holding the door open. "Come in from the storm." She hesitated, then stepped forward, leading her child inside. The bell above the door jingled, and warmth wrapped around them like a promise. The candle still sat in the bus window. Its glow, steady now, flickered against the falling snow. Grace came home for Christmas break not long after that. She brought a duffel bag full of laundry, a half-finished model of her latest project, and a sheepish grin. "I've been writing something," she said one night over tea. "About us, about this place." I raised an eyebrow. "About bread?" She laughed. "About what it means to rebuild, to lose everything and not lose yourself." I leaned back and crossed my arms. "What's it called?" "The Hearth Stays Warm, a True Story." I chuckled, brushing flour off my apron. "Just make sure you write it right. Not about revenge, but about rebuilding." Grace leaned in and hugged me, her words muffled against my shoulder. "That's the only story worth telling." Later that evening, after the chairs were stacked and the dishes done, I stepped outside with the dog. He was older now, moved slower, but still followed me out like always. The sky above us shimmered faintly. Northern lights, just barely visible, like a breath held in the sky. I stood there a long time, hand resting on the porch rail. "You taught me humility," I whispered to the wind, not to anyone in particular. "I built hope instead." The windows behind me glowed. Inside, laughter bubbled up from 2 teenage girls trying their hand at rolling dough for the first time. The bus, still part of the cafe, still very much alive, hummed with energy. The storm passed years ago, but the hearth, it still stays warm.